All right, we're ready to embark on this last part of the semester on what might seem like a completely different topic, but it's a topic we've been kind of building up for the whole semester. We've talked about what makes life life. We've talked about cells. We've talked about the chemistry of cells. We've talked about how we use energy, and energy is a primary driver for making cells work. Then we talked about organisms and their DNA. We talked about information. We talked about how information is necessary in order to tell a cell what to do. And then also information is needed to pass down information from generation to generation in order to tell the next generation what to do. But we haven't gotten to what's some really fundamental questions. And those fundamental questions involve the diversity of life. We haven't looked at all the different types of organisms. And then once you start to look at all the different types of organisms, those raise other questions. Why are there different types of organisms? Why is there so much variation? But there's also the additional question of why is there variation within organisms or within species? I'm going to have to define species as we go along. So even in this room, there's a tremendous amount of variation. We spent a lot of time talking about it, right? We talked about alleles, we talked about genes, we talked about multiple alleles and different effects. And I tried to explain the different variations in the room and how they are passed down from generation to generation. But what we haven't done is we haven't asked a more fundamental question, and that is, why is there variation? Right? Well, fundamentally, why is there actual variation? Why don't we just have one allele if one allele works for everything? So why is there variation? And maybe the most difficult question is, where did that variation come from? So I should have moved forward to this slide. So our topic for really the rest of the semester is talking about the diversity of life through these particular questions. So how variable are life forms on Earth? Today I'm just going to give you a snapshot of how different things are and what the diversity of life is. What is a species? Can we define what a species is? I think everyone has heard that term, but maybe haven't thought about what that really means. How do we classify things? How do we put things into groups? So species is one of those groups, but there are other ways of classifying organisms into families and orders and genera and so forth. Are all organisms the same? Are organisms the same or different as they were in the past? All right, so we don't want to just look at the present. We want to ask ourselves also, if I went somewhere in the past, whether it's not very long ago or whether it's a long time ago, were the organisms the same then as they are now? Will we see the same types of things? How is diversity maintained? I mentioned that before. How do we maintain the amount of variation we see in different species? And then what is the origin of that biological diversity? And of course, most people associate the last question with the word evolution. And of course, that is the topic of evolution, but evolution is also involved in all those other questions in a way. So that's the challenge I have, is trying to show you something about how we think that evolutionary theory or mechanisms help to explain the answers to some of these questions. And while we're going through that, we are going to probe some of the other associated questions along with that. All right, so let's first just take a tour of diversity and ask the question, what are species? Right, so let's just take a look at the world and look at what there is. And what there is really amazing. I think we really shortchange the world in terms of the amount of diversity there is to be found. So I had on my very first slide, I don't know if you recognized it or not, but there was a gecko on that first slide. Right, and that gecko looked very much like a leaf. It's called a Madagascaran leaf gecko for good reason. I mean, the geckos themselves look like they're mimicking dead leaves or foliage. So these are some other species. I haven't defined species yet, but these are other species of leaf geckos that are from Madagascar. And so you'll see this amazing coloration on this particular gecko here. It looks like it has all these different spots. It looks like little lichens or mosses growing on it. As you might even think that, well, there's just some kind of stuff growing on the back of it like there is on a mossy tree. No, that's actually its skin. And in its skin, it's grown these different coloration patterns, which look very much like the leaves around it. So why do you think these geckos, and different geckos living on different substrates here, look at this, it looks like a piece of dead driftwood. And even the eyeball, even the skin covering the eye when it closes its eye, looks like a piece of dead wood. Why would a gecko do that? What would be the function or the purpose of doing this? All right, so camouflage, right? So camouflage from predation, all right? Maybe it doesn't want to be eaten. Maybe there's some birds, or maybe those crazy lemurs from Madagascar have a particular liking for geckos. And so one of the ways to avoid being eaten, right, is to not be seen, right? To camouflage yourself. I can think of another possible reason. I can think of another possible reason why an animal might want to camouflage itself. It's actually kind of the opposite of being predated on. Yeah. To hunt. Yeah. In order to sneak up on its prey. All right. So it's sitting on a branch or something like that, and it's waiting for an insect to come close by that it can get. All right. So maybe it's wanting to sneak up on its prey, looking like the background. So either way, this is really a remarkable phenomena, and it really makes you ask really fundamental questions, like, how in the world does an animal develop the set of genes it needs? Because underlying all the things you're seeing here, this variation you see, is probably some sort of genetic apparatus, right? Some genes are being turned off and on to tell this animal to make these things. And each one of these are different species, meaning there's hundreds of thousands of these probably that all have the same similar look, although even they probably have some variation. So I'm not going to answer the question right now, where did that variation come from, or how did these things, come to be this way? But those are some of the questions we want to try to at least get a glimpse of and answer. So if you take any group, not the most dramatic group I have up here, but if you take any group of organisms and you start looking at them a little bit closer than just sort of superficially, like, well, I've seen a pig before, and you ask, well, what other kinds of pig-like things are there in the world? You'll see that there's lots and lots of other things that are like, kind of similar to our common pig, right? And we put them all in the same family of things, right? And the word family kind of sounds just what it sounds like. My family is more closely related to me than maybe I am to you, right? And we have a lot of similarities to each other. We're all individuals, right? But we have similarities and we're in the same family. In this case, we have a whole bunch of species of different pigs, pig-like things, and we put them all in the same family. But even your Suscrufa, which is on here somewhere, this pig right here, this is the one that has been domesticated or made into bacon, basically. All right. So there's many different sub-varieties of this. Kind of like think of wolves have been turned into all those domesticated dogs, right? Hundreds of varieties of domesticated dogs. Same thing has been done with this particular one right here. So even the variation in that one could be pulled apart into lots and lots of other different varieties of pigs. So variety is the spice of life, right? There's just lots of variety in every single organism you wish to imagine. If you were to look at a lot of individuals, you'd find that there are no two individuals the same. We've looked at identical twins, and even they are not really, truly identical. They're going to develop some slight differences, not just from the environment, but actually from mutations they have. They will be different. It turns out when you really look at things closely, you can find that there really is no such thing as two things that are the same. There's always variation. It's just a matter of how much variation there is. So here's dinosaurs. Now this is an extinct organism, but even dinosaurs were amazingly diverse. And then even within a species of dinosaurs, there would have been variation. I'm on the wrong side of my screen. I mentioned canines before. So here are all the different canines. So there's a lot of these. Every one of these here is a different species of dog, or what we think of as canines. And we include the foxes in there. And so I think most of you recognize that gray wolves are where dogs come from. And we have lots of solid evidence to show that all your domesticated dogs were derived from some sort of wolf ancestor or wolf stock. All right? They're just a variety of a wolf. And we have coyotes around here. I don't know if you've seen them, but they're in the Cuyahoga Valley. They run through my backyard down in Green. And coyotes are very similar to wolves. And so most of us would agree that coyotes, gray wolves, and dogs are all sort of very similar to one another. And in this particular chart, they're showing that they have what we'd say is a common ancestor, but we'll come back to that. But nonetheless, we have a lot of variation of canines, and we're going to ask the question, well, where did all those canines come from, and where did all that variation come from? So what we're looking at in general is what I like to call is the tapestry of life. Okay? We have this tremendous number of living things that do all share certain characteristics, and those are the characteristics we've been talking about in this class. We've been talking about translation and transcription, right? How you actually turn a gene into a protein. When I told you how that happens and I showed you how we read the genetic code, I was actually describing that for all the different organisms on Earth, right? So there is commonality. There are things in common that all living things have. We all pretty much metabolize sugar in the same way. We make ATPs. We have DNA as the hereditary code, right? So there's a lot of similarities there. But how those things are used and expressed in terms of the other features they make a wonderful diversity of life. Most of you, though, I suspect, when you think of living things, you think of maybe four things. You think of animals, you think of plants, you think of fungi, mushrooms, and maybe you think of bacteria. This is the head of a pin, and these are bacteria on the head of that pin. All right, those are the major groups. If I asked you to name me some types of organisms, you would start telling me different things, and I would just put them into these four different groups. Probably can suspect what's coming next. I'm going to try to show you that you have a very limited view of the diversity of life. I dare say that even a lot of biologists have a limited view of diversity of life because it's very hard for any of us to capture the real sense of how diverse life is. So this particular graphic is demonstrating the differences between different types of organisms. And I'm not really focused on the branches and how they relate to one another. I'm just interested in looking at these different names at the ends of these branches. So for example, I've got labeled the animals, the fungi, and the plants. All right, so when you think of the world around you and you think of fungi and you think of animals, well, all the animals, jellyfish all the way up to that tiger, they all belong right here. Now, what that means is every one of them is so similar to one another genetically and the way they operate and do things that they all are put together on one small little branch here. So that means all these other branches are as different, all right, from all animals as they are from everything else. All right? So you know about animals, but maybe you don't know about flagellates. All right? That's a whole different group of life which is as different from animals, right, as a fungus is from animals. Right? So there are a lot of other things in this world that are radically different, but maybe they aren't as obvious to us. We don't see them as much, and we're not as aware of them. So that's what all these other branches are all the other strains of life, all the other types of life there is on Earth. And we tend to focus on a few of them. Now, they happen to be important ones, and they happen to have a lot of species sometimes. So there are a lot of animals. Like there's over 1 million different insects. Some of these groups may only have a couple thousand or maybe 100,000 different species. So there's the land plants. So what I want to do is, and these are bacteria down here. There's a lot of different kind of bacteria. Let's home in on one of these, and let's just take a look at sort of this kind of a homing in and seeing closer and closer and closer the variation that we see. So let's go over here to the opisthokonts, which I don't know if you knew you were an opisthokonts, but we are animals, all right? And so here we have the animals, and like I said, all the animals are on this little short branch. So all animals run on the same operating system. I equated your genetic code and how you do your basic functions with an operating system of a computer. That means all animals essentially work the same way. That's why we're all similar to one another. I know we look different. A jellyfish looks different than a tiger. But fundamentally how the cell works is quite similar compared to other living things on Earth. So if we look at diversity of animals, we're pretty familiar with there's a lot of different kinds of animals, all the way down from microscopic animals all the way up to elephants. And there's a little bit of the variety, right? There's 10,000 birds. We've got about 5,400 mammals. There's 9,600 reptiles. Over 1 million different insects. Insects are the biggie. I mean, they're one of the most diverse groups of all living things on Earth. Let's look at birds. So if we go just to birds as one major group of animals, and then we go into the birds, we can divide the birds up into a variety of different groups that you would also recognize and be able to identify, right? You've got your eagles, and you've got your pigeons, and you have your ducks, right? And you've got your owls. Let's look at a favorite here. So there's lots of variation there. Let's look at penguins. So if we were to ask how many penguins are there, could we identify those? We'd see there's about 16 different species of penguins that we have identified. So these would be populations of individuals that all have similar characteristics, and they all mate with one another versus mating with a different kind of penguin. And that's sort of part of our definition of what a species is. Right? So these are all different species, and they live in different parts of the world. They may have slightly different behaviors and habits and what they eat and so forth, how they reproduce. All right, so let's go back to our big chart of all living things. And I don't have time to take you on a tour of all the different groups of life. Right? It would take us months and months and months. And really, even as a biologist, I could discover a new, and I could learn about a new type of organism every day of my life and not even come close to discovering all the diversity of life. All right? I'm only scratching the surface as well of the living things of this world. But let me take you to one maybe you're less familiar with, just to give you an example. Let's go all the way over to the other side of this thing. By the way, everything in the green here, those are all eukaryotes. Remember we talked about there's two kinds of cells, eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells? So let me go back here. Everything up here is a eukaryote. So that's why all of these are kind of lumped together. They all have a nucleus. Everything down here is a prokaryote, meaning they don't have a nucleus. And as it turns out, there's two major types of prokaryotic cells. I didn't tell you that before, but there are the archaebacteria, they're called, or the ancient bacteria, or sometimes called the extremophiles. And then there's the eubacteria, or the true bacteria. And E. coli is one of those, the one that's living in your stomach right now. So that's the three major groups we consider of life. But let's go over to the heteroconts, right? The ever-popular heteroconts. We talk about the heteroconts all the time, right? Those great heteroconts. So within the heteroconts, there's a number of different groups of things that we've identified as major groups of heteroconts. The phaeophytes are seaweeds. So you're probably familiar with seaweed, and you may think of it as a plant, but it's nothing like a plant. All right? It doesn't operate like a plant. It's so different from plants that plants are over there. Right? So they are fundamentally different than plants, even though they do photosynthesis. Well, it turns out these groups also do photosynthesis. So it's not just plants that do photosynthesis. These run sort of a kind of a different operating system in a way. They also do photosynthesis, but they're wildly different than plants. I want to look at the diatoms. All right, so let's look at the diatoms. And diatoms are single-celled organisms. So that's one of the reasons you're not intimately familiar with the diatoms, is they're single cells, and you have to get a microscope out to see them. But if you were to get a microscope out and look at seawater or pond water, and you were to look at it, you would almost surely see these organisms. They are individual cells that they grow a cell wall. All right? Now, plants also make cell walls. Remember, a cell wall is a material that a cell produces and then pushes out through their cell membrane and then coats the outer layer of their cell membrane with the outer wall, the cell wall. And you're writing on it if you have paper in front of you, because that is cellulose. That's what plants do. They make a cellulose cell wall. By the way, that's why seaweeds are not plants. They don't make a cellulose cell wall. They have a different kind of cell wall. This is a different cell wall altogether. This is made of silicon. They take silica out of the water and they actually fashion it into long chains of silica, which is glass. All right? They make a glass house. They literally fashion a glass house for themselves, a glass wall that they live inside. So the shapes that you're seeing up there are glass, the same as the window over here. So here's a living thing that makes glass, and it makes a glass house and it lives inside of it. So there are 100,000 different species of diatoms on this Earth right now. 100,000 different types of organisms that live in glass houses. And we say, well, that's crazy. Living in a glass house? Here's what they look like after the organism has died. So when the living tissue dies inside and it decays, the glass doesn't decay nearly as easily, right? So the glass is very resistant to decay, and it ends up being this shell. And you'll see these fantastic designs. So under electron microscope, you see these incredible images of these glass houses, and each one of these is, different than the other. Well, these are different species. So there are species that make billions upon trillions upon quadrillions of these in the oceans today. And then there's other species. Like I said, 100,000 different types of cells that make 100,000 different kinds of glass shells. This is just showing a small snapshot of the variety, right? Triangular, round, rod-shaped. And then when they die, right, they fall down to the bottom of the ocean or down to the bottom of a lake, and they form kind of a sludge at the bottom, which is this glassy mixture. Now, you and I wouldn't necessarily feel like it was glass, but it's very rough. Many of you might be familiar with these organisms if I give you the other name for them, the common name, Diatomaceous Earth. All right, that's a fairly popular product now for a variety of different things. But diatomaceous earth is just diatoms crushed up. That's all it is. And they actually get it by digging out. This is a layer of what looks like rock here, and it is rock. But that rock is made up of almost pure diatoms. So this is, I can't even count the number of diatoms that are here. All right? It's a trillion times trillions and trillions of diatoms. All have fallen together and formed this thick layer of material, which is just all glass. And we just crush it up, turn it into diatomaceous earth. Now, if you were an organism, why would you make a glass house? I guess is the question. Sounds a little crazy. But if you're a microorganism and you're eating individual cells, right? You and I could eat diatoms. In fact, every one of you has eaten a diatom, because if you've eaten water that's not completely purified, right? Or you've even spilled anything from any liquid source on Earth, and you've been to the ocean, you've swallowed ocean water, you've swallowed diatoms, right? So you've swallowed glass. Right, but this glass is minute, tiny, tiny little particles. Right, they're not necessarily going to damage you. It's not like they're going to rip your intestines to shreds. But if you're a little tiny organism in which this is a giant mouthful, that's a different story. That is like eating glass. All right? So and there are organisms that are specialists on eating these. In other words, they have developed ways of crushing these things in order to get out the living tissue inside. But a lot of organisms just avoid them. So this is a safety mechanism, all right? This is their protection. They live in a glass house for protection. Sounds kind of strange to say that, living in a glass house, but their glass house is their protector. So that's just the briefest snapshot. I don't have, I've spent too much time on that already. But I could go around that tree and show you that there's just wildly different organisms that have very different ways of living and doing things. They all are unified in a sense that even those diatoms are doing photosynthesis in a similar way to I showed you how photosynthesis is done. I have to throw in one little factoid about diatoms. You think of trees as producing the oxygen you're breathing in here, but diatoms produce maybe 25% of all the oxygen on Earth. That's how abundant they are. So many of them, they're producing oxygen. So they're very, very, very important for life on Earth, even though they're not seen and maybe not appreciated. So there is a tremendous diversity of life. But now let's turn our attention in the last 20 minutes to looking at how do we classify that then? How do we say, okay, so there are millions of different species on Earth, and I want to get some kind of handle on how to put them into different groups. I showed you that sort of tree-like thing, and it had different groups. How did those get those names? And in particular, how do we name the individual unit of life, which we call the species? All right, the species. So let's do a little classification here, and let me ask you, what organism is this? What family do you think that this organism lives in? And you can answer that. I'm asking. All right, so I hear feline. All right, so mammalian, that would be, in classification, that would be like the order or the larger group that it's in. So family is kind of like the smaller unit, but not so small as a species. I'm not asking you what individual type of thing this is. I'm asking you what group it is. So I heard feline, and that's right. All right, Felidae is the Latin way of saying it. But you could just say the cat family, right? How do you know that's in the cat family? Did everyone think that's cat-like? Yes. All right. You've all studied cats. You have a formal class in catology, so you know what cats are. No, I mean you have an innate sense for what a cat is because you've experienced cats, right? And even if it's just house cats, you've probably also seen cats in zoos. You've seen tigers, you've seen leopards, cheetahs. You've seen a variety of cats. What you've done is over your lifetime you've experienced cats. And as you've done that, no one necessarily had to teach you a cat has a particular type of tail, a cat has these ears, a cat has whiskers, a cat has retractable claws. Right? No one had to you didn't have to take a formal class in order to be able to say, okay, now I know what a cat is. Right? You learned that. In other words, all of you are taxonomists. You're all classificationists. Your mind, our minds automatically take information and sort it into packages and groups of things that can relate to things. And the reason we do that, the reason our minds are made that way, is because if something new walks in the room, we need to be able to put some sort of understanding to it without having to know exactly what it is. Right? Even if you had never seen this individual cat before in your life, you still had enough knowledge of cats to say that's probably a type of cat. Right? So you classified. Now, aren't all of you doing that in all of the works that you're doing? Isn't that why you're getting an education? You're interested in learning more about whatever your field of interest is. And of course you're learning a lot of facts, and you're learning a lot of like, well, if I see this, I will do this, and under this particular circumstance or this case study, I would do this. But what you're really trying to learn is you're trying to learn how to deal with a situation, how to take information you have learned and apply it to something new. Right? If you're not able to do that, then you will always be stumped and stymied by new things that come your way. Right? You won't know how to react. You'll react like, well, I haven't been told exactly what to do in this particular circumstance. Right? That's what you're trying to escape, is that kind of concrete thinking where you need to know exactly what to do and you've been told, if this, then this. You need to learn how to organize information and then apply it to new situations. And that's all biologists are doing in learning about organisms, is developing a sense for what that organism is. And all of you have done it with cats naturally. You didn't have to have a course in it. You've just done it naturally. Now, the scientific name for that thing right there is Felis cum color. Right? So this goes to, we'll talk about Linnaeus later, but this is the binomial epithet, the Latin name, the scientific name for this. The common names, you might have called it a cougar, you might have called it a mountain lion, you might think that's a puma, maybe a panther, or maybe a catamount. Might depend on what part of the country you're from, what part of the world you're from. You might see that and you're like, oh, that's a panther. And somebody else will say, no, that's a mountain lion. Well, you could actually both be right. Right? That's one of the problems with common names. Common names are like common to a particular area or people, but then when you talk to someone else, they have a different common name for that organism. That creates a conversational boundary, right, or barrier. Scientific names, one of the reasons we scientists have scientific names for things is that I can say Felis cum color, right, to anyone in the world who knows cats or studies cats, and they'll know exactly what organism I'm talking about because it's been described and defined and given that particular name, and that name sticks with that organism. So scientific terminology is meant to create the ability to communicate with anyone, no matter what their language is or their prior understanding. Or at least they can look it up and see exactly what I'm talking about. Now, what is this thing? What family is that in? It's not a trick question. I got ahead of myself. Yes, that's a cat too. Now, the reason I showed this one is because the prior one, maybe all of you have seen, either on a picture of a catalog, a magazine, National Geographic, you've seen it in a zoo, maybe you've actually seen one, right? So maybe you had some familiarity. This one is a very rare species of cat that you've probably never seen in a zoo, and unless you're a cat aficionado, you may have no knowledge of this cat. And yet you can still look at it and say, that's a cat, right? It's kind of a different looking cat. It has much longer legs in the back, probably can jump very, very well. This is the jungle cat from South America. Right? But it still has the characteristics that we would kind of place as being cat-like. Right? Being cat-like. So that's why I'm saying all of you are able to classify, and even if you've never seen something before, you might not know the specific species because you haven't learned that, but you can at least get it into a group. You can at least get to the point where you know what category you're looking at. And then you can use Google to find out what the species is. All right? As long as you get close to something, then you just can use Google to find out the rest. There's a lot of cats in the world. Right? But there aren't just cats that are alive today. What we know from paleontology as well is there's lots of extinct cats as well. So probably the most famous one that you may think of is like the saber-toothed cats. The saber-toothed cats have these long saber teeth. And I'll show you some other fossils there. Actually, this is a saber-toothed cat up here. There are more fossil species of cats that don't live today, than there are cats alive today. Right? So the diversity of the world I've been telling you about, in terms of like, wow, look at this, look at the world we have around us and how many different things there are, dwarfed, absolutely dwarfed by the number of fossil species there are in the world. For every group, there are more fossil species than there are living species. So that means there's been more different things alive on Earth than we can ever imagine are alive today. So diversity goes well beyond just what you and I can see through a microscope and with our eyes today. So now we come to this fundamental question. What exactly is a species? I've already used the word multiple times. Most of you probably had to memorize a definition of species at some point in high school or up to this point. John Ray in the 1700s was the first person to kind of articulate a definition of what a species is. What is a group of, you have a group of individuals, and you have the feeling that they're all so similar to one another, they deserve to be called some kind of group that's different than some other group of things. Right? Horses, right? I can see there's a lot of different sort of horses, but I also can see that they're different than donkeys. Right? So I see a lot of donkeys as well. What's different about them? He said a species is a group of individuals that can breed with one another and produce fertile offspring. And chances are that is very similar to a definition that you probably have memorized in the past. And that may be, if I forced you to write down what you thought a species was, many of you would come up with that kind of definition. Oh, it's something that you can't breed with. Right? If I can breed with something, then that's in my species. If I can't, then it's outside of my species. That's the fundamental idea. So his classic example, and it still is a classic, is you take a horse and you take a donkey, and they actually will breed with one another. And they will produce a mule, but the mule is sterile. And the reason for that is because they have different chromosome numbers, and it creates a problem in the mule. The mule lives and is healthy, but it can't actually produce any offspring itself. So that mutation causes it to be unable to reproduce. So if you've ever seen mules, and there are a lot of mules in this world, they're all produced by taking a horse and a donkey and producing mules, which have sort of intermediate characteristics. They're a hybrid between the two. So just for fun, I threw in other hybrids just to show that hybridization can happen. It doesn't happen frequently. This is a zorse, which is what it sounds like. It's a zebra and a horse. And zebras are very similar to horses, and they can interbreed, and they can produce an offspring like this that has intermediate characteristics between the two. Now, if I took horses and I took zebras and I put them into the same pen, right, this isn't going to happen very often. Horses have different behaviors. Right? Zebras have their own way of acting. The zebras and the horses will pretty much ignore each other, stay away from each other, don't want to have anything to do with each other. All right? This is kind of a forced situation. Where there's just one and one, or maybe it's been fertilized on purpose by a human. So it shows that genetically they're still similar enough that they can interbreed, but in the real world, it just doesn't happen that often. And therefore, horses and zebras are distinct animals, and they stay distinct because they only reproduce with each other. This is actually fertile, I believe. It can have offspring. So it could cross with another horse, or it could cross with a zebra. What would happen if horses and zebras always crossed with each other? We wouldn't have horses, and we wouldn't have zebras. We would just have zorses, right? Because all their genes would be mixed back together. right? We take all the genetics of both and we mix them together and we get something in between. The fact that we have zebras on this earth and we have horses on this earth tells us that they do not interbreed very often. So even though they're capable of it, they don't do it. So we consider them a good species.
So for those horses,
yeah.
Since like the colors they don't really mix together, is that co-dominant?
Yeah, that's a really tricky case of what makes the coat color. Right. I would say that what makes the stripes and what makes the color are multiple different genes. So in some cases, one's dominant and recessive, so maybe white is there, but then having stripes might not be dominant. And there's some other tricky genetics there, which I can't go into, but it has to do with maternal effects, and there's some other weird genetics that happens. Epistasis, so which is what that video was talking about. There's some other things that make the expression of this kind of strange. Now, I show this because it makes it look like that's another hybrid, but in fact, this is an actual species. So just looking at something doesn't tell you, is that a species or not? You'd have to do the hard work of looking at, is there a population? Do they interbreed with other organisms or not? This is an okapi, right, which is, what do you think that looks like? What do you think it's most similar to? I think you said it, giraffe, right? And it is. This is the closest living relative of a giraffe. So we think of giraffes as being very unique, but there is an animal that is that same, those ears and the face. See, there again, you've seen giraffes, and you kind of put those features on. But on the other hand, you haven't seen giraffes with stripes, and it doesn't have a long neck, although it does have a slightly extended neck, and its legs are very similar to giraffes. So this is not a hybrid. This is an actual species that lives today on Earth that is giraffe-like. All right, so back to my question about what a species is. I'm teaching a class right now called Systematics. It's a 400-level biology class. We spend the first 4 weeks answering one question, and we don't actually answer it. What is a species? All right? It's a deeply philosophical question, actually, that has lots involved with it. So I'm not going to do that to you, but I do want to tell you it's not easy to define what exactly a species is. Some things are easy to define, others, because there's so many different living things on Earth, we don't have one uniform definition. So it works pretty well, except that some organisms reproduce asexually. So if your definition says you're able to reproduce sexually with another organism, and you don't reproduce sexually with another organism, which a lot of plants don't, fungi don't, bacteria don't, lots of other things on that tree don't reproduce sexually. They don't combine two things to make another. Right? If they don't do that, and your definition says a species is something that interbreeds, then you can't even apply that definition to them. Right? So that right away tells us we can't use that definition for all living things. Sometimes there aren't reproductive barriers. So we have a lot of oaks and maples outside. They're kind of promiscuous trees. They will interbreed with other species. But they don't do it very often. So a sugar maple is different than a Norway maple. But if a Norway maple lives next to a sugar maple, you'll get hybrids between the two. Right? They won't do that as often as they'll breed with themselves, but they will outcross. So what we end up with is, this is considered a better definition, but scientists argue about definitions. There's probably 20 different definitions of a species, but this is one of the more accepted ones. A species, therefore, is generally defined as a group of organisms that is unlike other such groups. In other words, I can see that there's differences between this group and that group. And they generally don't integrate extensively with other groups in nature. Put horses and zebras together, they still won't interbreed. All right? So in nature, they will stay away from each other. Right? They won't commune with one another. And as a result, they don't interbreed with one another. How do plants do it? Plants might be living right next to each other. There's 2 different sunflowers, and they look really similar, and they're different species. How do they stay separate? Sometimes one flowers in August, and the other one flowers in September. So as a result, they can't cross with each other. Or maybe one attracts a certain pollinator, and the other one has a different attractant for a different pollinator. So the pollinators aren't going from one to the other. So therefore, they don't mix with each other. Plants have lots of strategies for maintaining their own genetic identity or integrity and not mixing with other plants. So back to my list of just the numbers of different things on this earth. So we said insects are one of the most diverse things, over 1 million. We've only identified a couple 100,000 and given them scientific names. There could be 5, 10, 15 million different insects on Earth. Right? Everywhere we turn, we discover new insects every single day. Incredibly diverse. There are not nearly as many things like birds. There's only about 10,000 birds on Earth, species. Mammals, there's only 4,000. I think this number's a little old. I would say maybe 5,000 named mammals on Earth. Right? But mammals are big. You can only fit so many different kinds on Earth. Insects are small. You can fit a lot more of them. You can fit 100 different species of insect on one tree. So a couple additional points. I only have 5 minutes. I'm not going to get through the whole thing. So let me get through, I think, one more major point. The vast majority of life on Earth is extinct. The vast majority of life on Earth is extinct. Every time we look and we ask the question, how many of something is alive today? So cetaceans, whales. And how many do we find in the fossil record? There's more in the fossil record than there are alive today. All right? So there's been a lot more things that have lived in the past. I haven't said how old that past is yet. Let's not get to that question yet. Let's just say they aren't around today. So we're saying maybe 10 to 100 million different things are alive today on Earth. Right? We've only named less than 1 million of them. But there's a lot of things yet to be named. So maybe there's 100 million, really optimistically, of things alive on Earth today. How many things have lived on the Earth, based on our estimates from the fossil record? Probably 10 billion to who knows how many. Very hard to tell. But 10 billion is a much larger number than 10 million. Right? That's a number that's really hard to comprehend. How possibly could that many things have lived? So let me give you just a couple examples. So today, this is a picture of all the living cetaceans. Cetaceans are whales, dolphins, and porpoises. Right? Those are all the mammals that live in the sea. There's 88 of them, maybe 89, depending on whose classification you follow. Right? But we know of about 150 species of cetaceans that are fossil species that we know don't exist today. So we've identified 150 additional cetaceans, which include other whales, porpoises, and dolphins, and other things that are hard to define as either any of those, but clearly they're whale-like. Right? They may not be exactly like the whales today, but they're clearly some kind of whale, a mammal that lived in the sea. 150. So we're pretty amazed by 88 different cetaceans on the Earth. But there's twice as many in the fossil record, and that's only the ones we found so far. And there's only so many people looking for them. Right? There's new ones identified every single year. So that'll probably go into the hundreds and hundreds in the future. And then there's groups that don't exist today at all. One of my favorite groups are the sea reptiles. Right? Everyone's heard of the age of the dinosaurs. Right? When the dinosaurs lived, Cretaceous, Triassic, Jurassic age. I prefer to think of that time as the age of the sea reptiles. Because in the oceans, there was over 500 different species, and those are just ones we've identified so far. 500 species we've identified of large sea reptiles that look a whole lot like cetaceans do today. Right? Huge animals that look like dolphins, they look kind of like porpoises, and some look like whales, although most had very sharp, elongated teeth, which is different than the mammals today, which generally don't have teeth at all. So that's a whole group of things that don't even exist today, but dwarfs the number of cetaceans we have in the world today. So one other example, before I quit here. So elephants are great organisms. I love elephants. But we only have 3 species of elephants alive. And some of you are probably aware that there's a couple other elephants that were around not very long ago, like the mammoths, the woolly mammoth, of which there's millions and millions of fossilized mammoths in Siberia and in North America. And mastodons, which we had right here in Ohio. There's one right down the hall. There's a mastodon skeleton as you walk out that was found here in Ohio. In fact, I think that's Summit County. Right, so mastodons, those are two other elephants. Clearly they're elephants. They're just hairy elephants. But most of you probably don't know that there's 177 other species of elephants that we've identified from fossils, with all different sorts and kinds. All right, different sizes, different tusks. Some had tusks coming out of the top jaw and the bottom jaw. Some only had them out of the bottom jaw. I like this Dinotherium right here. This is the actual skull right here. It's found in many places in Africa and Asia. So it has these funky tusks that wind around the bottom. All right, and it probably had a short snout. We don't really know how long the trunk was. All right, what about this one right here? Here's an actual fossil right here showing the chewing molars here. But it's like, it's like your jaw just got pulled out and you put your front two teeth out here in the front. So somehow it's like, I don't know if it's scooped up stuff or something instead of having a trunk. All right, but most of the other features were elephant-like. So when you think of elephants and you think of cats and you think of dogs, you're actually only thinking of a tiny, 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 tiny bit of the variation of life that's been on Earth. Not necessarily alive today, but at some point on Earth, there's been 177, and that's just the ones we know about. That number will surely go up. So last slide. Oh, I'm out of time, but these are different species that are alive today versus all the extinct ones in those same different groups. We'll pick it up from here next time. Thanks.